Hey guys, welcome to the first video in my series on how I built this Dark Knight Batsuit from scratch. This video is going to be an introduction on the materials and the basic processes that I'll use. So let's get into it. A few years ago I uploaded a video to YouTube that was a slideshow showing photos of me making each part for my Dark Knight Batsuit, but I didn't actually really give any information on how I was making each part, and since then a lot of people have contacted me to ask how I actually do it and what materials I've used. So I decided I'll put together a video series to show you exactly how I've made each part. In this introduction video, I'm going to show you the materials that I use and why, and give a brief overview of the mold making process to take your piece from the master through to the finished piece. In each individual video, I'll go into detail about how I actually make each part, but rather than keep repeating myself, this video will be the information that's generic to most of the parts. Now, because I've already made the suit, a lot of the information that I'll be giving will be done using photos, showing molds that I've already made, and in some parts I've had to remake them since that first video, so I'll give you some updated information on the best way to actually put this together. On my suit there are some parts that are worn out and need remaking, and some parts I've actually worked out better ways of making them. So for those particular parts, I'll be able to show you me actually go through and make those upgrades. Now, the first step with any new build is you need to start gathering a lot of reference materials, using still images from the film and behind the scenes, but also photos of the screen use suits that have been displayed in various places around the world, and people have taken tons of detailed photos and uploaded those to the internet. So I go through and I gather all of those photos together, categorize them into the different parts, then I can keep referring back to those as I need reference for each individual part. Now, a word of warning when you're gathering your reference images, I got caught out by some of the images that I gathered were not actually of the screen use suit, but they were of fan-made suits. Now, the fan-made suits and templates and things like that you might find, overall they might look very similar, but once you actually start putting it together and you're looking at all the individual details, you'll find that a lot of times people get it really wrong. So my rule of thumb now is that I'll only use photos taken of the screen use suits and the production-made parts. So the next step is to look over your design and work out areas where you might have to actually change the design to make the suit practical to use. Now, what I mean by this is in a film production, you'll have a team of people who are making parts, helping the actor get dressed, managing the suit while it's on set, and then helping the actor get out of the suit again at the end of the shoot. For most home builders, we don't have that luxury, so we have to make the suit ourselves, get into it ourselves, wear it and manage it ourselves, and then get out of it again ourselves. So there's certain things that you might look at the design and actually have to make changes. An example of this would be the cape in the Dark Knight films. Apparently there were 50 different capes that they built. Now these capes would be different lengths and widths to suit different purposes. Now of course we don't want to necessarily have a big billowing cape dragging behind us if we're going to a Comic-Con, getting dragged through gum, food, mud, and possibly if you have to go to the bathroom, being dragged across the floor there. So I decided to go for a shorter cape, so my cape would sit just off the ground, and that way I wouldn't have to worry about it getting dirty and wearing out too quickly. So these are some of the kind of design changes that you might need to make just to make your suit practical for your kind of use. Now, another big design choice that I had to make was what to actually make the suit parts out of. There are two materials generally that get used when people are making a Dark Knight Batsuit. The screen used suit was made out of a material called polyurethane rubber. Now, polyurethane rubber actually has some big disadvantages. It's very expensive, it's quite difficult to use if you don't have any experience with it, and it tears very easily. Now, once it's torn, you actually can't repair it. And I've seen photos of the screen used suits on display, and they're covered in small tears, so even the screen used ones would actually get damaged quite easily. Because I'm looking for a suit material that I can wear for years without having to continually remake my parts, I decided to go for latex rubber. So latex rubber can actually stretch. If you've got weak points, the latex rubber will stretch at those points, whereas the urethane rubber will try and tear. So for me, the latex rubber was an easy choice, but it does come with some disadvantages. The urethane rubber, when you're working with that, there's actually less steps to the moulding process, but I'll go over that a little bit later on. Latex, fortunately, is very cheap, readily available, and really easy to work with. Latex rubber actually shrinks by 10% after you've let it dry, so all of your masters have to be 10% bigger than you need them to finally be, to take into account this shrinkage. Now, whenever I'm working on a costume piece, I always try and work on rigid materials wherever possible. So with a part like the cowl that I've had to sculpt, I've actually sculpted it, pulled a mould, replicated it in solid resin, and that way I can use builder's fill on it, I can sand it, and I can get a perfect finish. But for the parts like the cowl or the shoulders, I do need to start off with a clay sculpture. Now, there's two different types of clay that I use. There is an oil-based clay, or there's another clay called wet clay, W-E-D, which is a water-based synthetic clay. Now, I used to use oil-based clay primarily for these sorts of sculptures because often I would start sculpting and it could be weeks or months before I'd actually finish my sculpture. And the beauty of oil-based clay is it doesn't dry out at all. So you can start today, you can put it on the shelf, come back to it, and in months' time, a year's time, it'll be exactly the same as you left it. Whereas the wet clay is a much nicer clay to use. It's smoother, it's really easy to get a good smooth finish on it, but it does have one big disadvantage. Because it's water-based, it does dry out. So if I create a sculpture like this and I walk away from it for any period of time, when I come back, it will have started to dry out and it will shrink and crack and my sculpture will be lost. So if you're leaving it for a short period of time, you can wrap it in plastic wrap and that will keep the surface from drying out, but that's not ideal because the plastic wrap will leave an imprint. You'll damage your sculpture anyway. So it's really ideal for sculptures that you're doing from start to finish over a fairly short period of time. And as I said, once I finish my sculpture, because for something like this you need to get that surface as smooth and perfect as possible, rather than working on the sculpt over and over again to try and get that perfect surface, it's actually easier to replicate it in resin, and then you can use sandpaper and builder's fill and you can make your changes. And as you see here, even though I've actually finished my suit, I've come back to this master and I've started to build up the nose to make some changes because I wasn't happy with the way it looked. So for a future version of my cowl, because I've been able to come back to my resin master and start making more changes on it, I can keep this progressing until I get it exactly the way I want, whereas my sculpture, of course, is long gone. Now, with a lot of the parts, like the leg parts and the bicep pieces, although they're quite shapely when they're on the suit, you can actually make them flat, mold them flat, and then cast them up. So when I'm working on my flat parts, I'll actually start with my reference photos from all different angles. I'll splice together pieces so that I can make a flattened image to show exactly what it would look like laid out flat. And then I would make a paper template. So once I've got the paper template, I can cut that out, I can put it on, I can make sure I'm happy with the size and shape of it, then I'll bring it back into Photoshop, enlarge it by 10% to account for my latex shrinkage. I'll put it onto some MDF board, trace around it, trim it, put in any details that I need to, and then I can pull a mold. So here's a master of the 3 spine pieces glued onto a backboard. So this is made entirely out of MDF board. I've sanded in and carved in the grooves and shapes and things on there, used PVA glue to glue that down to a board, glued that to a slightly larger board, and then used some MDF trim just to box that up. So the reason it's grey is I've sprayed it with an automotive primer. The automotive primer helps you keep sanding to get a really good finish on it, particularly on the areas where you've been cutting into the board, because it tends to go quite feathery. So I will prime it, sand it, prime it, sand it until I get it exactly the finish that I want. So once I've got it all boxed up like this, I'm ready to pour my first silicone mold. So I pour my silicone into this mold, and once it's dried, I can peel that back out and I end up with a negative impression of my master. So this is what I would refer to as my silicone negative. Now that I've got my silicone negative, if I was actually going to use urethane rubber, I could pour that straight into the 3 cavities, just up to this top edge here. I could let that cure and then peel those pieces out and they'd be ready to use. So that would mean I wouldn't need to make my pieces 10% oversized, and I could actually stop right at this mold here. But for latex, there's a few more steps that we need to go through. We've taken our silicone negative off our master, which was made 10% oversized, and now we need to put a mold release onto this surface, which I use petroleum jelly just on a little chip brush. Just brush that on, get a nice even thin layer, and then we would pour silicone over the top surface of this. Once we've poured that silicone over, it will end up looking like this, and as we peel off our cured layer, we now end up with a silicone positive, which is an exact silicone reproduction of our master. So the next step for us is to pull a plaster negative off the silicone. So we would mix up some casting plaster, we would smear that all over the surface, and we would end up with it looking like this. So we have our plaster negative, which we can now take off our silicon positive. Now the urethane rubber is a two-part mix, so that will cure by itself, whereas latex is more like paint. It actually cures by evaporation. So if we painted the latex into our silicon negative, it would take forever to dry. It would form a skin on the surface and it would take weeks, possibly even months before it actually dried. So that's why we can't pour it straight into our silicon negative, we need to pour it into our plaster negative. And the difference being that with the plaster negative, we pour the latex into the 3 cavities, and then the plaster will start to absorb the moisture out of the latex and help it cure. So a piece like this would actually set in about 24 hours, even though we've got it filled right up to the brim on all of the 3 cavities, and then we can peel our pieces out, trim them, and we've got our finished parts. Now that's fine for our flat pieces, but for parts like our shoulder bells, there's a slightly different process. Because they're much larger, if we fill that up with latex and we just leave that to set the way we would have done with the flat pieces, we'll end up with a big solid chunk of latex that's not going to sit on the shoulder properly. It's going to weigh a ton and it's just going to be useless to us. So the process is similar. We'll actually fill this up to the top edge with latex, but then we will leave this to dry for about 24 hours, and when we come back to it, it will still look liquid in the middle. We can then pour that liquid latex back out into our latex pail to be used again, and what you'll get left with is a layer sitting inside your mold of uncured latex that's thickened a lot, like almost the consistency of butter, and you'll have a big thick layer around the outside edge. We can now leave that to just air dry, and that plaster will continue to draw the moisture out, and because the bulk of the latex is now out of the mold, that will start to dry out and we'll end up with our finished piece that will be a good consistent thickness layer of our shoulder shape. So for all of the larger parts, like the cowl, the shoulders, the cod and some of the other parts, that's going to be our process. To fill the mold up, leave it for a set amount of time, which will vary depending on the piece and depending on the thickness we want to build up. The longer you leave it in the mold before you pour out the excess, the thicker that piece will become. So if you really need something to be extra heavy, like the shoulders, you can just leave it in the mold for longer, then pour out the excess and you'll build up a thicker piece. So once we've got our latex pieces out of the mold, they need to be trimmed and then cleaned thoroughly. And to do this, I use a nail brush with some soapy water and give it a really good scrub to get any surface residue out of that latex piece. Now neither the urethane or the latex come in black. You have to actually tint them. So with the latex, you can tint that using a poster paint, or you can put in some black iron oxide pigment, and that will actually colour the latex black, but it's still not dark enough for what we want. So once we take our cleaned latex piece, we need to give it a paint, but we can't just use an ordinary paint. What we're going to use is a product called Plasti-Dip. Now Plasti-Dip is the most common product, but there are other brands like the Duplicolor Custom Wrap, which is pretty much the same product. So go for whatever you've got available, but make sure you get a matte black finish. So the way Plasti-Dip and similar products work is they're actually a synthetic rubber spray. So because our parts are nice and flexible, if we put on any paint or anything like that, as the parts flex, it would start to come away from the latex. But because Plasti-Dip is flexible, you don't have that problem. Now Plasti-Dip does have fumes, so make sure you work in a well ventilated area and use a respirator. What we're going to do is spray on a really light coat, give it a scrub in with the chip brush, then we'll keep spraying on more light coats and scrubbing them in until we get the desired colour. Now when you're using the Plasti-Dip, stop as soon as you get the desired colour and consistency. Don't keep going, so less is more. And the reason for that is as the pieces bend and flex, the Plasti Dip, if you have a really thick layer, it can actually peel away, and people use it to paint automotive parts so they can paint the wheels on their car, and when they want a change of colour they can actually peel it off. But to do that you need a good thick layer. So we're going to use the opposite and go with a really thin layer so that it stays flexible and difficult to remove. Another advantage of Plasti Dip is that it dries really quickly, so within a couple of minutes of painting the piece, that's ready to actually use. But when you're painting it, be careful not to get any Plasti Dip on the back surface, because all of our parts will either need to be glued onto the suit or they'll have Velcro and different fixtures attached to them, and we want to glue those pieces directly onto the latex surface, not onto a Plasti Dip surface. Now, with all of the processes that I'll use, I'm not saying mine is the best way or the only way. This is just the way that I've chosen to do it. So if you decide you want to make your suit out of urethane, that's absolutely fine. Just stop at the silicon negative and you can pour your urethane straight into that. But for my build, I'm going to continue using the latex. So that's the basic process of making the latex parts for the Dark Knight Batsuit. If you've got any questions, leave them in the comments section below. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and stay tuned for more videos as I upload them.